Light, Anne?
It can be your green light.
All right. Welcome to everyone who's joined us today. As Anne mentioned, we expect a full house of over 100 participants, so we're grateful that you've carved the time out to join us. My name is Gail Anderson, and I am fortunate to be on the land of the Pueblo Tewa and the Jicarilla Apache, and I want to acknowledge them. On behalf of my colleagues, Ann Ackerson and Dina A, we welcome you to this maiden voyage and public launch of the Resilience Playbook. And we thank Matt Kirkman, who you may see from time to time, who's back of the house managing our technology. So thank you, Matt. Our objective for this webinar is to provide you with an overview of the Resilience Playbook and to reveal to you how it's been inspired by our observation and research on the needs by museum and cultural sectors. The playbook itself is a roadmap based on this resilience model, again, something we will share with you today. And the playbook contents explain the core strategies and approaches to guide museums toward resilience. And as you will see in the rest of the presentation, we will get into more detail. We hope to give you enough information today to help you consider the state of resilience in your own organizations. And later in the webinar, we will share with you some of the ways you can engage with the Resilience Playbook and the members of the Resilience team. If you would all please mute your audio, little housekeeping here, forgive me. And as your thoughts arise during the presentation, please feel free to drop them into chat. But if you come up with a question that you would like to ask us as the panelists, please put that in the Q&A, and Matt will be monitoring that as we get to the Q&A section at the end of today's presentation. We also have a raise hand feature, so we urge you to use that as well. And so the webinar is being recorded and will be available on each of our websites. And so now let's begin. And Matt, would you please give me the next slide?
Gail, there's already a couple comments about your volume. If you could please speak into your microphone.
Right. Gosh, it's almost all the way up. I'll lean in.
Just project. There you go.
Better? All right. I have a big voice. Most people know that. Anyway, I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce the team that has put this Resilience Playbook together. And Anne and Dina and I will each introduce ourselves and explain a little bit about what brought us to this project and what our hopes are. And so I'm going to turn to you first, Anne.
Thanks, Gail. Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Ackerson, and I'm coming to you from Troy, New York, the land of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I've had the good fortune to work for a variety of small history museums over my long career, as well as a statewide museum association and a national archival association. And along the way, I've thought a lot about the evolving ethics and best practices of our work. When I co-authored the book Leadership Matters with Joan Baldwin, I was treated to a front row seat in learning how museum leaders approach their work. And two of the shared characteristics of all our leader interviewees were their ability to be resilient and thus agile. Dina?
Yes, thank you for that. And hi to everyone. I'm so glad that you're here. I look forward to being able to talk with you more as we progress through the webinar. And as we get started here, I just want to quickly acknowledge that I currently reside in Atlanta, the traditional homelands of the Muskogee people, and that I'm continuing to work in ways that honor the ancestors of this land. So thank you for providing that. Before becoming a consultant, I started as a high school English teacher. And so those who know me know that that is a foundational aspect of who I am and how I work. And then I worked at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta before I started my consulting firm and working with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. I learned so much about leadership and empathy and growth in working not only in museums, but with museums. And since 2016, when I began my consulting firm, I've been increasingly committed, I think, to the fact that resilient individuals support resilient organizations, and more resilient organizations support more resilient communities, and how it just continues to ripple out into the world and make a positive impact. So that's really what drew me to this work, and this work especially with Gail and Anne. Gail, I think I'll pass it to you here.
All right. Thank you, Dina. I am very honored to work with these two extraordinary women. And just to let you know, I'm in Santa Fe, just so you've got us all placed on the map there. But throughout my career, whether I was chairing the JFK Graduate Department of Museum Studies, working at the Museum of Northern Arizona and the Southwest Museum, very focused on Indigenous peoples, and then running my own business, I've committed my time and energy to supporting museums achieving relevance and advancing greater social responsibility in their work. My hope for the Resilience Playbook is that together, museum leaders will do the work of some soul searching, addressing embedded issues and realities of exclusion, and therefore evolve to become inclusive, anti-racist institutions engaged with our broadest public. In March, I felt it was time to create a new pathway for museums, and that's when I reached out to my two extraordinary colleagues to join me on the journey. It's been a constant learning process for us, and we welcome you to this journey as we move forward. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks. So our first slide up is why resilience? And here it is, almost the end of January 2021. Are we ready to exhale yet? Well, let me give you a chance right now to take a deep breath and exhale slowly. So many cultural institutions of all types have done a phenomenal job of shifting their work to online platforms, working from home environments, and implementing safety precautions. For that, you deserve a tremendous amount of credit. But it's not time to exhale yet. The really hard work has just begun. The world and cultural institutions have suffered deeply these last 12 months. And as the pandemic revealed the many inequities in our society, it also revealed structural, philosophical, and ethical weaknesses within museums and arts and cultural organizations. The list on this slide may very likely resonate with you. Clearly, our organizations are not immune from coming to terms with their deep institutional histories and their relationships to wealth and power, which provide substantial sources of their support, of course. Museum leaders are being asked difficult questions from their communities, their staffs, and their donors, and much is expected from their responses. Outdated practices and longstanding traditions that have been immune to critical examination restrict a leader's ability to deploy their talent, skills, and financial resources where they're most needed. And we're not talking about complete dismantling of museums. I know that you have read a lot about that, and maybe you're a proponent of that. And certainly there are some, perhaps many cases where we are talking about radical change in those institutions. But what we're advocating for is really the creation of a new organizational ethos grounded in transparency and accountability, fueled by equity and shared authority, and facilitated by diverse voices and technologies. Resilience, we believe, is empowerment, and it's essential to navigate in today's world. Dina and Gail, do you have any further thoughts that you'd like to share at this point?
I think I'll just chime in a little bit, Anne, with to really stress the urgency in this work. It is a moment, an unprecedented moment for museums to do this work. And I think it's essential.
I think that wraps it up for me. Let's go ahead.
I'll just add one thing, and that is that to me, we were talking about this yesterday about metaphors for resilience. And we talked about trees, willow trees, as opposed to sturdier trees. To me, resilience is kind of like a slinky or a spring. In fact, it's a motif that we use in the playbook because it allows for latitude without breaking, and it can stretch far and yet bounce back into shape. And I think the last thought I would leave on the subject at this moment is that resilience takes practice. We're not necessarily born with this skill or skill set, and it does require some practice continually, I think. So, Gail, back to you.
All right. Next slide, please, Matt. Thank you. So what I'd like to say here is what brought us to this and what was the impetus. And I think really some threads have already emerged in what has been said. Really, to achieve resilience, that is the ability to be agile, responsive, and accountable, means that we have to learn skills to navigate disruptions. And that is part of our new reality. And it will continue to be so. And also to address racial inequities. Museums have the opportunity to reflect and understand deeply what their history is and what the changes are that are going to be needed to build inclusive, integrated, and nimble institutions. This is an unprecedented opportunity. I know I said that a minute ago, but this is a moment to pause, reframe, rethink our roles in the world, understanding our responsibilities, our work, and understand how we are accountable in our practices, in our work. Others are watching us. So I just want to say that this is not about adding a program or changing a policy. This is holistic, transformative work. And as I said earlier, to me, it's essential and it's most urgent. If museums want to be of value to the vitality of their communities and have meaningful impact beyond their four walls, this is the work that needs to be done. Dina?
Thank you. So I think that the part that I really want to focus on that Gail just brought up is about transformational change, right? That it really needs to be holistic. Sometimes when we think about DEAI work or anti-racism work in particular, it's like, oh, the programming team can do this, or, oh, this group doesn't have as much of an impact. But really looking at this from an organizational space in terms of change and also that holistic nature of it. We all experience the world through a multitude of identities, lived experiences, contexts. So as I'm thinking about resilience, I do think about the need for people and so organizations to become more aware, right? More aware as individuals, more aware as organizations. And so that awareness, I think, leads to greater curiosity, which leads to more knowledge, which hopefully leads to more empathy, and then leads to more action. And so resilience allows us to move through this cycle of curiosity, knowledge, empathy, action more and more quickly, right? I think that's part of what resilience is. And just to recognize as well, something that Fabiana said in terms of the SAP, right? Resilient organizations also have a SAP that allows others to thrive. I'm hoping, right, that we are creating the SAP that is part of this. Resilience kind of is the SAP that creates organizations that can more positively move forward. So thank you for adding that in, and I love the idea. Anne, what about you?
Well, I really like that too. And for me, resilience, I'll just build on that a little bit, I guess, by saying that resilience does allow an institution to process external challenges, but first by owning their own positives and negatives and making internal adjustments to stay relevant and responsive. I think far too often we've seen cultural organizations resort to knee-jerk responses or half remedies when they're faced with disruption. And a lot of that is just expedient, I think. But I think our reason for creating, or one of the reasons for creating the playbook, was we wanted to provide practical approaches and support to assist organizations in breaking this reactionary cycle. Next slide, please, Matt. Dina, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I will go with the next slide, which is about the resilience model that we've come up with. And in thinking about the resilience model, there are multiple goals here. And so the goals then have various plays that come with them. And the plays then have a lot of strategy and tactic that come with it. And so as we think about the model here, we're thinking about the intentionality of bringing rigor to the process. And when I talk about the process, I'm thinking about reframing, realigning, reinvention as part of that process. Again, cycling of what we're doing. And hopefully with that reframing, realigning, and reinvention, we're really focusing on creating new mindsets, or at least updating mindsets that people currently have about understanding as individuals and as organizations. And so the plays themselves, once we get past the goals, right, the plays are asking organizations to self-assess, to define alternative pathways, right? Things that we haven't thought about or roads that we haven't gone down before. To clarify impact, I think, not just thinking about intention, but impact. Develop potential scenarios. So what is our best case scenario? What is a realistic scenario, et cetera? And then create plans that actually integrate all of this thought work into action so that we maximize the development and the alignment with institutional capacity, capability, resources. So we've got the goals, we've got 20 plays, and then within those plays, again, we have a lot of detail and practical steps about how to guide that work. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at the diagram that Gail and I have created. And as you're looking at this, right, so the diagram, I think, reveals realities around museums and also within museums. So looking both internally as well as externally. It shows the interrelationship of the 5 goal areas. We'll talk often about how they're all connected. And then taken together, the goals form a system of really tightly interrelated operational components. So again, not just in theory, but in practice, that we think are the lifeblood, or again, the sap of the agile, responsive organizations that we want to help build. And I think the other thing about this model is that the diagram itself underscores the tenets behind the model, and the fact that we're really centering equity and inclusion as our guiding point throughout all of this. I'll be talking about that in goal number 1. But before we get to that, I think another aspect of the guiding points are about our guiding principles. And so, Anne, I would love to throw it to you for the guiding principles slide.
So next slide, please, Matt. Thanks, Dina. A key element of any resilient organization is how individuals and teams learn and work together. And this goes for staff, it goes for the board and staff, it goes for volunteers too. And one could argue that it underpins our communication with our audiences and other stakeholders. The same holds true for teams working with the Playbook. And we've listed on the slide some of the guiding principles that we feel are critical to making Playbook conversations successful. And here you have, things like being curious, checking assumptions, engaging in dialogue, not debate, and patience for all of us to listen better and to be open to changing our minds. Frankly, these are principles every organization should be embracing anyway. And I'm sure that the list is, there might be nothing new on that list for some of you. What they are, we think, they allow people and organizations working with the Playbook to take an integrated and holistic approach to the 5 goals, the 20 plays, and their related action steps. Dina?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think as we're thinking about this as a whole and what it means to be a resilient organization within a more resilient community, what we need to be thinking about, of course, is activating and practicing equity and inclusion. So if we go to the next slide, that's the first goal here. And we purposely put this as the first goal because we do believe that its tenets go out and around all of the other goals, or if you want to say it's a good foundation upon which to build. So equity and inclusion really is at the heart of what we were thinking about as we created the model and the playbook itself. So when we think about resilient organizations and what resilient organizations embrace, I think that there's really an intention, a need, especially right now, to move past intention and into action. I see that all the time with clients and just friend organizations, that their staffs are saying, enough with the talk. How do we move forward, right? And resilience is really about a mindset, I think. It's about a state of being and being ever flexible, always being in an assessment, always being in movement and being comfortable with that. So when we thought about activating equity and inclusion as being central or essential really to aspects of resilience, we thought about that in terms of current and future decision making. And when I talk about equity and inclusion here, knowing there's a lot of information in the playbook, I'm talking about it in a really broad sense, but also at the same time, recognizing specifically in the United States that there's an imperative to address racial equity in particular. So I see it as a both and situation. As you see with the slide, and as you'll see when Gail and Anne talk about some of the rest of the goals, there's a need to continuously reflect and acknowledge the organization's past in order to have better insights and make more informed decisions in the present and in the future. Also, I think that there's a power in shared language. So folks who have worked with me before, I think that's the start of a really solid foundation, and that sometimes we actually put up barriers or gates and talk past each other when we don't start with that shared understanding. It's important in terms of equity and inclusion to recognize that it's not just soft or abstract, but that we actually can create measurable goals and we can hold people accountable just as we would with other aspects of a strategic plan. And then the final aspect, I think, here is a recognition that equity and inclusion efforts should be made individually as well as departmentally and organizationally and with stakeholders, so that it's not just the work of one department or one group or one level, but that it involves everyone and everyone has a role to play in that. So if we move on to the next slide here, I think that this will show you the 4 plays that we have within the goal. Again, there's a lot more detail underneath those plays, but we wanted to recognize that there are plays, that these are the 4 plays for equity and inclusion in particular, and that when you're looking at these, you'll see a couple of words that I just want to spotlight. Assess, institution-wide, foundation, prioritize, plan, integrate, and center. So you've heard me already talking about cycles and the way that we work through processes. All of those are part of that. So each goal, each play interacts with each other. In the playbook, you'll see a lot of like reference goal number 1 or pay attention to play number 20 as you move forward. So cycles of assessment and building and prioritizing and planning and integrating and continuing that over and over, no matter where you start. Gail and Anne, is there anything you want to add before? I think, Gail, you're moving on to goal number 2.
Right, that's correct. No, I think you did a great job setting the stage for this. And I just want to reiterate that this goal that Dina so eloquently outlined is central to museums becoming resilient. And Dina, thank you. That was very helpful. I'm watching the time a little bit, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. I've got half 30 after the hour. So renegotiate community values. So you can see the points that are listed there, but let me provide a little bit more on that. And goes back to the point that at the onset of COVID, it laid bare that most did not consider museums essential, which triggers the whole concept around renegotiating community values. It's important that we shift the lens and we look outward and away from just satisfying our own internal goals. So this particular goal is very in depth around that. And let me just add that because of the very goal that Dina so nicely laid out, is that we have to take our place at the table addressing issues that are on the global stage. Racial inequities, climate change, educational systems in crisis, immigration. We have to figure out where we stand on these, and we cannot sit back and expect others to do this work. We have to take our rightful place at the table. And I think we have a lot of work to do there. This goal centers on building and sustaining relationships and partnerships so that we become part of the ecosystem around communities, and that they turn to us, that we're at the table solving some of those issues so vital to community vitality. Apparently I'm still not talking loud enough. Is that better? Kathy, is that better? Sorry about that. I'd like to go into the next slide, please, Matt. So here we have the plays. And as I said, Dina described the way these goals and plays have been structured and how important the work is around equity, anti-racism practices, and inclusion. And I guess I would add there that doing the hard long-term work around anti-racism is essential to support equity and inclusion. And this is work that our institutions very much need to do. So I'll look at play 5, and it starts with the idea of a deeper understanding of communities and diverse publics. And it's about going into the communities, having conversations, listening first, leading with humility, and understanding their realities, their strengths, stories, histories, and perspectives. Museums have tended to do community work at arm's length or to suit their needs to shape a program or exhibit. That cannot be what we do moving forward. It has to be on the basis of rich long-term relationships. And communities, as we know, are diverse and complex, and they're very different, and they're absolutely not monolithic. In Alaska and my new home state of New Mexico, indigenous communities, for example, are complex, distinct, and evolving. Whether Black communities, self-identified communities, socioeconomic diversity, every community has their own history and their threads and realities. I have to tell you, it's not about us. It's about how our community value ties and is revitalized. Who are we serving? Who works in our institution? How are we playing a greater part in the vitality and health of our neighbors, towns, and place? And with predominantly white-run museums, there's a lot of work to do here and much learning to be done. So I can't stress enough how critical this is. Could we go to, oh, let's see. Are you saying I need to speak up? Oh, I just got a note. Matt has just told me I'm nice and loud now. That's good. Matt, can we go to the next slide, please, for goal 3? And I'm not going to read through the bullets. You can see those. And I want to talk about, this is a very robust goal because it's really reimagining the role of the institution. And if you think about what Dina said in equity and inclusion, and what I've just outlined ever so briefly about integrating into communities, all of that means that the shift of the role of the institution is required, right? That it means inside out, outside in. We have to really start getting out of thinking within our four walls. In this goal is the very challenging work around confronting, naming, and owning exclusionary practices and our colonial roots. This means doing the deep internal work by challenging every operative assumption and facing the historic roots of how each museum came to be, and obviously within the larger arena of how museums were established to begin with. It's about looking at, who are we doing this for? We're not doing it for us. We're doing it for the public. We're doing it for a very diverse public. What is the impact and path we want to take forward? Why are we doing this work? And then why do museums matter? Going back to the point during COVID, we were not considered essential. It was said over and over again, and even by government leaders. So what is our place in the dialogue and participating in positive change? Next slide, please. So this one, probably my favorite one, is going down to the studs. I think that this play gets at peeling back the onion, all the layers, so that we can see all the aspects of our assumptions around how we've practiced, what are our assumptions around public programs and public services, obviously addressing exclusionary and colonial practices. And from that, of course, later on, mapping out, figuring out what to change, discard, develop, and how to shift operations. So let me mention a kind of a painful example for all of us, which was being very clear about digital strategies. Museums were caught flat-footed, not all, but many, because digital presence had been considered more ancillary. And all of a sudden it had to be the vehicle for communicating with the public. So we have to really look at, where does that fit in now and moving forward? For example, what about the priorities of collecting? What collecting biases are present in what we hold in our institutions? For whom? Whose voice? How have they been documented? And forgive me, for a lot of you who've known me for too long, you know I'm going to say this. It means this has to be tied to rethinking mission, vision, values, and commitment, institutional commitments to support the change. It's about incorporating the prior goals into this new sense of being. It is key. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anne to talk about goal 4.
Thanks, Gail. And I'll just add that I think goal 3, doing the peeling back, as you say, and going down to the studs. Gail, that takes a tremendous amount of work, yes, but it really takes true commitment to want to do that examination, that excavation, if you will, and to gain clarity from that exercise. I think it's absolutely important that museums really need to question what the heck they're doing in every aspect. So I'll get off that soapbox and move on to goal 4, which is about retooling financial mindset. And this goal, of course, underpins the work discussed in the previous goals, because frankly, without financial resources, it's really difficult to move substantially and substantively forward on any of them. Understanding the connections of financial resources to the reality of an institution is absolutely critical. But too often, the focus seems to be solely on covering deficits. That's slaps us in the face every day. And that's in covering deficits is often done, I think, somewhat knee-jerk reaction by cutting back and also trying to raise more dollars. Clearly, there's a need for greater financial literacy among all staff and board members. We don't have enough of it. I don't know. Those of you who are directors, you've probably heard some board members say that they have no idea what those financial statements mean. and we might also be faced as department heads trying to put together department budgets, but having no idea of what the bigger picture is. So clarity, transparency around all of that I think is really important. So take the time that's necessary to train and to be financially transparent and accountable. Resiliency, we believe, is grounded in how well current financial resources align with mission impact, the likelihood of those resources continuing in the light of social shifts and the desires of long-standing supporters and so forth, and the need to broaden and build more robust financial models. So all of that needs to, no doubt, I think, be reframed and realigned, certainly. And planning efforts must translate into financial realities, right? When you think about, I often say that the financial piece is the fuel that makes the engine of the mission go. And there are a lot of organizations that like to focus on that engine, but they don't think about the fuel. So the two are linked, and to create linkages among financial assumptions to the institutional priorities and commitments is a real must. Gail, you want to pick it up from there?
Yes, I'm happy to. Matt, next slide, please. So, Anne, thank you for that. That was very helpful. I think that this area is probably the one that people thought the most about when COVID hit. And I would maintain that depending on what an institution's purpose is and how valued it was in the community, definitely factor into it. So embedded in this goal is looking at all the assumptions around your finances and resources and the stability of the resources. For example, if you're getting city funding, that may be most likely shrinking significantly. And so how do you respond to that? So the point I really want to make here is that every institution should have 3 financial scenarios: optimum, probable, and limited. And that means that they should be developed annually. It should be very clear what and how you approach those scenarios as they are linked to the mission and the purpose of what you are trying to do. I can't stress it enough. Anne said it pretty nicely about the lack of financial acuity and understanding of what these numbers mean, but the numbers are the story of who you are and what you're doing. So with that, Anne, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk about leadership.
Great, thanks. Next slide, please. Our 5th and final goal is about advancing agile leadership. And this final playbook goal speaks to our understanding that institutional reframing, realigning, and reinvention are unlikely to occur without organizational leaders, including staff leaders, who are receptive to making change. And as we know, change does not happen by itself. It requires a sense of urgency and champions for change, combined with an integrated and inclusive approach to examining organizational cultures and organizational structures. And that means that we've got to unlearn some old behaviors in order to pursue a new clarity of purpose rooted in a values-first approach. We must re-examine roles and responsibilities, departmental missions, committee charters, job descriptions, and the policies and procedures that tend to bind up the works and really prevent us from being as agile as we want. I think, the goal here is to cut through that red tape. And I use red tape not as a financial metaphor. I think we need to accept, and well, I don't think, I know that we need to accept that no one person has all the answers, especially when it comes to complicated and unwieldy crises like COVID-19 and systemic racism. Resilient leaders use diverse teams to help them problem solve. And in doing so, they foster learning environments. Next slide, please. So our 4 plays here, not surprisingly, address leadership at all levels and issues like organizational culture, structure, and learning. And clearly Goal 5's work does begin at the organization's top, but I think everyone in the institution can have a role to play in that. It's virtually impossible to make transformational change if the organization's leadership is unwilling or unable to engage in meaningful dialogue and planning around realignment and impact. Of course, any significant change effort, as I'm sure you well know, begins with being self-reflective and being aware of the need for change. Equally challenging are organizational cultures and internal structures that don't support change. You know, the constant tension that's created by misalignment and misunderstanding and even misinformation during a poorly planned change effort is likely to end up in a failure. And the likelihood that few will ever want to embark on another change effort anytime soon. And at the risk of being patently evident, actions do speak louder than words. Of the 4 plays in this goal, I'd like to focus a bit on play 20, which stresses the importance of building a learning organization. This has been, when I've raised it in other groups, it's been confusing for some. But the bottom line here is that it's not about creating educational programs for external audiences. What we're talking about here is embracing a continuous cycle of internal inquiry and knowledge transfer in order for staff and even volunteers to align and grow with the mission, the values, and the world around them. And in doing so, learning organizations are more in tune with issues both inside and outside the 4 walls of the museum. And that results in learners with remarkable capacities for resiliency and agility. And I will say there's a lot of literature out there on organizational learning, and I encourage you to jump into it if you haven't already. The work of Play 20 asks organizations to stretch the boundaries of seeing and thinking by defining the qualities of a learning mindset. You know, what does learning mean for our organization? And identifying where team learning could be most beneficial by tying organizational learning to strategic or scenario planning and institutionalizing coaching and mentoring opportunities, which are not done enough, and much more. You do need to keep in mind that every play that you're just seeing the top line of probably has 10 to 20 action steps underneath them. Next slide, please. Another thing that we built and that we're really proud of is our resilience rubric. And you're getting just a little slice of it here on this slide. You probably can't even, some of you might not be able to see it very well. We wanted organizations to be able to quickly evaluate their current situations vis-a-vis each goal and play, along with a pathway from interested to invested, so that they could, actually see how organizations at different levels work within that play, within that goal. So each play also includes some non-negotiable principles at the top and practices that we believe every resilient organization must embrace. So this just gives you a tiny idea of what that rubric is all about, but I think it's going to be a really useful tool going forward. So I'm going to pass things over to Dina now.
Yes, thank you for that. And with our maybe final major slide here, at least, thinking about the resilience caveats, right? So we've all I presume, tried to make some type of organizational change here. We've all thought about change management and who needs buy-in and how this actually happens. I see some of that in the chat as well. And so as we're thinking about this, just to kind of wrap back around to the philosophy or the mindsets that Gail and Anne and I have been thinking about, we believe that making resiliency your organization's highest priority will make you move faster and more effective and more efficiently. We think that any change effort requires some sense of urgency, planning, and management, while at the same time recognizing that this is a journey, right? That there will be a continual self-assessment and evaluation. I think that without commitment from staff and board leadership, if some of you have already cited, then creating resilient organizations will stumble, but that stumble can also be a teachable moment or a learning opportunity as well. And then it's really important to recognize all of the small wins within your plans, because those small wins will buoy people up, will help to keep momentum and energy, and recognize that this isn't a marathon, it's a sprint, right? And so as we're thinking about some of the questions that have been coming in, just keeping those beliefs front and center in sort of how we're focusing on this. And so with that, I think that we will move on to our question and answer time. I know that we've put a couple of different things here in the Q&A. So I will look through those and then kind of parse out some of these aspects as well. So the first question that we have is about resilience, and is it seen as an attribute of an organization, as a larger culture, which organizations are aiming to support, and catalyze cultural adaptation and transformation, or is it something else? And I will answer quickly, and then if Gail or Anne has something to add. For me, it's a both and, right? You'll hear that from me a lot, that it is both kind of a state of being within an organization, and it is also how organizations support these aspects in the world. So Anne and Gail, do you have anything that you want to add to that particular question?
Well, I think it ties right back to the fact we've talked all the way through today that the model is integrated, holistic, and transformative. So it can't be the responsibility of a staff member. It has to be embodied by board and staff. And I've been reading other chats, so I know someone has said this, but I mean, this is really the long game, and learning and making some short wins, as Dina mentioned just minutes ago.
Thank you. Gail, anything before I move on to the next one?
No.
Right.
I'll answer for Gail.
Oh,
no, I
Gail,
think
sorry.
you both have summed it up really well. I think it is both.
Yeah.
And the more an organization practices resilience, of course, they'll be known for that.
Mm.
But I think the environment demands it. And many aspects of the environment or the ecosystem are becoming more resilient also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So they kind of work together.
Another aspect, which may or may not be an actual question here, thinking about the slides and feeling sad that there isn't a level of trust and respect in museums to make this a reality, or a museum-wide effort. And I think to that, I would simply say that that's what we are working toward, right? That people come with all different experiences and thoughts about hierarchies and whose job or responsibility it is. But we do think, Gail and Anne and I do think that we can build a level of trust and respect to make it a museum-wide effort.
Yeah.
I
Not
would add,
easy.
no, I would add, I'm working with one organization on this model right now. And if it were not for the impassioned leadership of the director, who has brought along the board and invested the time in the work, I don't know that we would have left the tarmac It's really essential, and it's conviction for the long run. It's a long, as I said, it's a long game.
And I'm just going to jump off of that with another question, because I think it's sort of the flip side of this, right? Which is, as a non-management level employee, how would we, the three of us, suggest bringing up reshaping our organization with senior staff who are potentially set in their ways? So if you aren't already that passionate leader, right, or you don't have a passionate leader in your organization, how do we get them to support something like this?
And you should jump in.
Well, there's, a lot written about leading up. In other words, you're on staff, you're a department head, or you're, a department of one, and you want to make some substantive change in the institution and become more resilient. I mean, there's certainly, a lot about leading where you are and modeling best practices with your staff or volunteers who report to you. But this notion of leading up and finding ways to impact those above you, to engage in dialogue that may lead to self-reflection, may open some opportunities to rethink things. I would say that, shouldn't be discounted. On the other hand, I'm a great fan of champions. And I feel that for staff people, or maybe it's, a stakeholder who really cares about the institution and who has embraced institutional change and resiliency, needs to help a staffer or another board member or whomever it may be to help leaders sort of wake up and sort of face the challenges ahead, and to think about resilience in new and different ways. And there are people who carry a lot of external or informal power, and those can be brought to bear on leaders who have the formal title and typically the formal power. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Anne. Yeah, Gail, quickly.
Yeah, real quickly. I think the other, my hunch is that the folks that may be, as this person who asked this question may be stuck, they may not be aware that there's a need for change. Cold showers are a good idea. I'm sorry, that's not what you're going to be doing. But the point is that those leaders will need to get to the place where they're even aware and accept there's a need for change. And that could be a long road. And I'm going to add just one small thing. For those of you who may not be in a leadership role and you're ready to make change, and I know this may not sound like it's what I should be saying, but if you're not in a place that will allow you, and just I support exactly what Anne said, but if it won't allow you to participate in the way you wish, or it doesn't align with your values, I think there's some really deep personal work you might want to do to really decide, because life is short and you want to make an impact. Back to you, Dina.
All right, thank you for that. And we have lots of questions coming in, so going to try to group these if I can as we're moving forward, or just ask for one person to kind of answer, hopefully on behalf of all of us. Sure. So one question that we have here, which hopefully is a big question, but also with a pretty solid answer, is the idea that the pandemic and concurrent crises have made it clearer than ever that environmental health and environmental justice, I would say, and human health are intertwined, and therefore addressing only one is incomplete. And this person says the resilience playbook seems only to relate to the human journey, and is that true or not, or somewhere in between. And so if one of you would just like to jump in on a recognition of environmental justice and health as part of the playbook as well.
I'll jump in. Environmental justice is huge. The shortcoming of doing something like this is that we're not able to cover everything. And I did mention about taking a stand around climate change, but injustices have laid bare a whole host of issues. And some institutions will be very well suited to address that, but I think all institutions should take stock in it. And I thank the individual that brought this up. Thank you.
Great, I appreciate it.
Well, and I'd just quickly add that a number of the plays and the actions within those plays, as I mentioned, every play has probably 10 to 20 specific actions that an institution takes. There's a lot of room within the plays, I think, for institutions to kind of focus on issues that maybe burning issues for them, or to go into these directions that can be woven together. And we certainly would encourage that. And this is not supposed to be a cookie cutter kind of answer, or the playbook's not meant to be a cookie cutter kind of response. Those plays are really meant to get institutions talking within and with their communities without, and really putting together responses that are to some extent uniquely their own.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there are a couple of questions here that kind of get into this idea of the customization and the process of the playbook, how people might go through it or what happened. So one person here is saying, would you suggest that museums tackle these plays in each department separately before coming together, or implementing organization-wide? So for example, this person has an institution that has internal working groups that are organized by topic, like transparency, and comprised of members from various departments. And so thinking about thoughts in regards to processes here, is it sometimes organization-wide work? Is it sometimes departmental work? Is it sometimes cross-departmental work? What are you all thinking about that?
Boy, I have to jump in and say, I think this is institutional-wide work. However, that said, these working groups, if they're really functioning and strong, they may be places to do deeper dives, but then it needs to come back to the full institution. It can't be compartmentalized. Everything that we're talking about is creating a basis for a new orientation for the institution. So I think that's really important. I will talk in a minute about other ways that you can tie into the resilience playbook. So I'll save that for a few minutes from now.
Dina, we have an attendee with their hand up. It's Voss.
Yes, Voss, why don't you go ahead while I kind of round up a couple of questions here together.
Voss, I may need to unmute you. Hang on. Let me find you in my long list. I should have been doing this while I was listening to.
Well, why don't I go ahead and take another.
He can unmute himself.
Oh, he can?
Potentially. Voss, try that.
Okay, you can talk now.
Oh, all that work only to say that I hit it by accident.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, we know it works.
All right. Well, then, thank you for that, Voss. Sorry to call attention to the accident, but that did give me time to pair two questions together, I think. So one is about our thinking on applying this model in other types of institutions outside of museums, like colleges and universities. And the other question is about our perspective kind of on the field of museums, thinking about museum associations and how museum associations can help catalyze this transformational change and work sort of across member museums and society as a whole. So maybe pairing those two together to say, who is this playbook actually for, and how do we want that impact to ripple out?
I'll jump in first and say that it is for museums, arts and cultural organizations, heritage organizations, frankly, every nonprofit, every nonprofit across the sector, I think can use this. In terms of associations, I think we're open to talking with associations to see how we might be able to create cohorts of institutions within a state association or a regional association to see how we might be able to catalyze work together and actually increase the learning through cohort work. Gail, I know you've been thinking about this too.
Right. I think that the idea of cohorts, as a team, we're thinking about how to make this accessible. And our team did, as Ann said, talk a lot about cohorts. And the thing that's key about a cohort is finding the right mix and the right size so that the addressing of the issues is relational to the members. So I have a question for you at the end about that. And that may help inform us on some, our first cohort group. But I know Charmaine asked about universities and I forgot what her other example was. Charmaine, I would say I'm happy. We're happy to talk with those other organizations, but we have a task in front of us, which would be to work with museums and cultural organizations first. But maybe give us a week or two, and we'll get back to you.
I think as we're putting this together, and as I at least am thinking about how to make that impact ripple out, there are a lot of questions and or comments that were both in the chat as well as in the Q&A about resistance. And some of that is internal resistance by individuals. Some of it is about internal resistance by the organization as a collective. Some of it is about kind of external resistance in terms of people's worldviews, conservative or progressive. And so there are questions about generally how do we target this area of resistance, right? From kind of that external point of view, questions about how do we take these strategies and practices from that intention or yes, I agree with you in theory to how to actually make it about action. And then also, I think in that is this recognition that it's hard to look inward, especially at our institutional past, and move forward from there. So kind of general questions about internal and external resistance and how we think about dealing with those.
Well, I can start off a little bit. That's actually a really, really great question. And I'm going to say to my fellow team members, we need to talk a little bit more about how to respond to the resistors. I'm going to repeat something that I've already said, which is this is the long game. And I think with resistors, and this I'm really shooting from the hip here, but access to thoughtful writing, access to other, peer groups, peer institutions who are doing the work where there can be a vision or an example of how the change has taken place. And some folks respond better to be able to listen to a colleague talk about it. What they've encountered and what the challenges are. But we have more to think about with that. I thank you for that question.
All right, I appreciate that. So I have some super quick questions, knowing that we've got about 6 minutes left by my watch. So one, will this approach work for small organizations? Two, I'm forming this as a question, although it was kind of a comment. Will there be like awards given to resilient museums in a year or two or a couple of years? And then three, I think in terms of kind of quick question, not really quick, but thinking about philosophically, can we talk about trade-offs, if there are, of doing diversity, inclusion, anti-racism work, and at the same time thinking about premiums on agility and responsiveness and being nimble? So are those actually trading off for each other? Do they work together, right? How do we think about that? So are there trade-offs, or do we see that differently? Are there kind of intentions or awards or something later? And will this work for small organizations?
Your reward will be in heaven.
And
No, I meant that as a joke. Trade-offs. I think it was not our intention in putting the playbook together that there would be trade-offs, but frankly, on the ground, we're always trading things off and on to make things work. I noticed Charmaine had made a comment in the chat about the fact that maybe it's not so much about change as it is evolution. And clearly there are institutions where sort of wholesale change might be able to happen, and many others where it really is going to be an evolutionary process. And I think it's really up to that institution in dialogue within the institution to figure out what the pace of evolution / change can be, knowing that there are just so many personalities involved, and it's just very rare that an institution can turn like this in a very short period of time.
I'm going to just chime in a little bit, and then I do need to close out the webinar. Anne mentions pace. If all of this was taken on at the same time, there might be an implosion. We definitely see this as paced and arranged in an order that suits the institution. And to that end, definitely small institutions. I think the challenges are a little different because they may have fewer people to hold the work. But I go to the equity and inclusion. It must start there. And I guess I would even pull in the colonial practices, but it can be in bits and pieces, trying to figure out, Dina said this, short wins, figuring out ways for some short wins. And honestly, the equity and inclusion, it is work for the long run. It needs to be embedded in institutional wide conversations.
Well, I think most of this is.
Yeah.
And none of these goals are kind of like one and done. They require continual effort and honing.
All right. Well, Gail, go ahead and close us out.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for participating and for the thoughtful questions. And it was clear you were all very present. It was hard to kind of listen and look at the chat. I try to do my job there, but I very much thank you. And I know that Anne and Dina and Matt, thank you as well. I guess I would end with a few things. These times are urgent, and this is a moment to act. And it is a time for leadership to ask the tough questions and determine what levels of change will be embraced. Yes, I'm making a mental note about the resistors. And it's a time to understand how aware, how committed leadership is. And really the level for conviction is essential. So we have devised this so that every institution can start from where it is. Now, I told you I would describe a little bit about ways that you can access the Resilience Playbook. The Resilience Playbook is designed for institutions where they purchase the playbook and they can have varying levels of guidance from us or quite limited. We are looking at a course. We are looking at the cohorts, which already came up. Probably additional webinars will happen, coaching, and strategic planning. All of these things are avenues depending on where the institution is and what it is eager to embrace. Longer term, we are doing an article for museum. It'll be in the May-June issue. And I have just started the work on reinventing the museum, which will be based on the resilience model. But that, as you can imagine, won't come out soon. So we want you to give us some feedback, email us, tell us, hey, this is what my situation is. What do you suggest we do? If you think the idea of a course is appealing, let us know. Or if you want an additional webinar, we need to hear from you. And so we welcome that, which is why our information is on that last slide. And I want to just say that Anne and Dina and I, again, thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Matt, for being the man behind the curtain there, making sure we stayed technologically on point. And, we are thrilled you were here. We invite your comment and we'd like to continue the conversation. So let's continue the journey. Be well, stay safe, and be courageous. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.